Hello, good afternoon, good morning. Welcome to Data and AI Live. Thank you for tuning in. I know we got people both sides of the Atlantic tuning in. Today we are talking about job interview secrets for data and AI leaders. So I hope it will be a valuable session. Our guest is Rob Barham. I'll bring Rob in now. Hey Rob, how are you?
I'm doing great, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, a pleasure. Rob, I think this has been in the works for a while with you and I, so really glad that we can get this live. And it's certainly a sort of topic that's a bit of a passion of mine, because I think in my career I sort of see what separates often the best data and AI leaders and the people that get the bigger jobs is often that ability to, I think, communicate and influence the C-suite. So yeah, looking forward to a really good session today. For everyone, I think Rob, if you don't know Rob I think is an ideal guest to have on for this, because his background is he's held 3 overarching data leadership roles at well-known companies, the Very Group, Gousto, and now at Global, all of which reported into C-suite. Over his career, he's interviewed hundreds of data and AI leaders for his own teams, so he's seen a thing or two, good and bad, through those experiences, I'm sure. And Rob also has a job interview video on YouTube, which has racked up, I think it's over 1 million views at this point. Rob, is that fair to say?
It has, yeah, over 1 million at this point.
Which for a job, which for a job interview video on YouTube is a rare thing. So, and I'd actually encourage, what I'll do, I'll put a link to that job interview video in the comments after the show, because I think that video is excellent, and for data and AI leaders or anyone, it's a really good resource if you're looking to prepare for interviews. Today we're going to cover, just to give you a brief idea, we're going to start by talking about why so many data and AI leaders sort of struggle to land from a communication perspective with senior execs. Then we'll go on and talk about what C-suite and senior execs are really looking for, or looking to hear in job interviews, and some examples, good and bad. And then finally, we will give you some sort of free practical solutions to take away from the session today, which hopefully will help. One is a data storytelling framework, which Rob will talk through. And then the other is a sort of simple commercial mindset hack that you can use to demonstrate a commercial mindset to senior execs at interview. Just before we get going, a couple of bits of housekeeping. We will do a Q&A at the end. But at the same time, if you've got questions at any time during the show, please put them in the comments down below, because we may take them as we go through. If not, we'll endeavour to answer all questions at the end in the Q&A. So please, any questions, queries, get them down in the comments box below whenever you can. So let's get going. I guess to sort of throw you into the fire, Rob, let me ask you a sort of big question to start with. Why do so many data and AI execs struggle to land with a senior or C-suite audience at interview?
Absolutely. So I think with interviews, although it's something we don't do that often, it's a very valuable skill and useful skill to have. And it kind of connects to what we do most of the time internally anyway. Often we are telling stories, we're building relationships, the kind of things that you do in an interview setting. And I think for data leaders, the classic case is we're quite factual, we're quite formal, we're quite descriptive. We'll talk about how we did something and the mechanics from a technical perspective. We might be simplifying it, we might be using metaphors, but we're still talking about what we built and why it's interesting. And then I think instinctively, we tend to not talk enough about what the delivery actually meant, like the business challenges it solved, the outcomes we landed, what they mean for the organization. And we also don't talk about them in a way that will necessarily engage the audience as much. We're inclined to be more descriptive when you want to be telling an engaging story where you can. So I think it comes down a lot to almost what took you through your career to this point isn't what's going to take you to the next point. Those skills and being able to get into the detail, understand the mechanics of what you're building and what your team's building are critical. But then as that flips, particularly for people who are new to data leadership, shifting your mindset and your approach to the commercials, why it's important for a business, how you affect change and how you demonstrate that in an interview process is what tends to be important. So it's a little bit from the background we've all come up from, I think.
Yeah. So actually, what we're going to talk about is very transferable to a data and AI leader's daily role as well.
Absolutely.
Is that fair?
I think that's absolutely fair. Yeah. A lot of it comes down to storytelling. And whether you're doing that in an interview or whether you're giving a snappy update to someone on something that you or your team has done, often the same principles apply and you want to be demonstrating the same things.
Yeah, I see. Why and something that I hear a lot, so why is it that the skills then that a leader in this space, the skills that get them to the dance, and what I mean by that is the skills that get them to that position of leadership, why is it that those skills don't necessarily help them once they are there?
Yeah, so I think data probably more than many career tracks, as you go up towards leadership level, the characteristics that help you be successful shift pretty radically. If you're say a marketing or sales executive, what you're doing day to day as a junior professional, building relationships, being able to tell stories, all of that helps you right the way up the ladder. With data, you hit a certain pivot point where you need to be a change agent in an organization. You need to turn the organization into something different from what it is when you started. And you need to be articulating the value of what you're trying to deliver in a way that business execs understand, which is not what you're doing at all early on in a track, especially if you're coming from one of the more technical ends of data science, engineering, something like that. So I think there's an element there of the journey you have to go on and how that flips, which is somewhat distinct for data professionals. And then I think it's a bit about temperament, if I'm honest. Like the majority of people in our industry, we're left-brained, we're focusing on the facts, we're focusing on the detail. We are right to do that. But while that's been useful for us up to this point, often the execs will be engaging with, over time will become increasingly more right-brained. So being able to articulate things in a way that's more emotive resonates more with individuals and not from that background, where it's less like an academic paper, it's more like a novel in a way. That becomes really important. And again, that's not something you need to do as much early in your career, but it's something that's going to be very important when we hit that shift.
Yeah, and I guess that's sort of unique to tech and maybe data and AI sometimes, because I guess if you're on a sort of sales career track or marketing career track or finance, it's often the skills that you're building and leveraging to come up through that track are going to help with that influence in a way that doesn't happen in this space. That being said, then, are there any sort of, let's say you're a junior or mid-level data and AI professional watching this, and maybe you've recognized that, hey, this is what I want to be doing, but I'm not necessarily getting to practice or leverage these skills at the point I'm at in my career now. Any tips, resources that you'd recommend for someone like that to start practicing? I don't know if practicing is the right word, but I think you know what I mean.
So I think the best thing you can do is try it out and get yourself in these situations. And depending on the team setup you have or the organization you're at, you might be doing amazing technical work, but you might have a product manager, a product owner, or another exec above you who's handling all of the stakeholder relationships and the articulation of the value of what you built. And you want to try and insert yourself more into that process. So if you're someone who's maybe mid-level and you know you want to go up a leadership track rather than a technical track long term, I would be saying to your managers, to your product owners, I want to be in these sessions and I want to be talking about why we're building what we're building and what we need to do next. And then use that as a way to practice. And then I think the other thing is just finding an internal mentor. There's no substitute for that. So if you see someone who's very good at this in your department or even beyond, try and pair up with them. And then over time, you'll get tips, tricks, things you can do along the way. And you'll also just see from someone else who has a certain style and be able to adapt and make some of that your own if it works for you. That's how I would play it. And then you'll be seen. The benefit of this is if you're doing that stuff, you'll be seen to be doing it. And then if you do want to go up the ladder and get to a manager level or beyond, you'll have plenty of examples where you're in the room, you're doing the things that you'll need to do at that stage. So it will give you that track record at the same time.
Yeah, yeah, that's really good advice. And as an aside, actually, I've heard of, or I've known data AI leaders who have done even sort of left field things, such as do drama school courses or join Toastmasters, or things like this to improve the communication and kind of level of impact that they can have through communication. So that may sound a bit left field, but I've seen those things work for people. And I guess a lot of it is just having that self-awareness that, hey, maybe this is something that I can improve or I can work on.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it starts with that. And the same, I've seen people who've successfully gone from manager to head of and beyond, where something like Toastmasters has been a really key part of their success. Improv
Yeah.
classes as well. That's another one people tend to do.
Yeah, I mean, that's a brave one. Probably the most brave one. Did in terms of your and not to get too off topic here, Rob, but I guess in terms of your background and how you came up in the first few roles of your career, did that, and I know you were at McKinsey, I think, for a few years. Did those early roles help you develop these kind of skills? And if so,
Yeah,
sort of
big
how
time.
was that?
Yeah. So I my first role right out of uni was an analytics role with a startup, and then I did a few years in consulting, like you say. And the analytics in consulting was very, very basic. But what was really useful was some of the training that you get on storytelling, on structuring a PowerPoint deck, on comms. And they invest a lot in that. So you would have like a comms coach if you wanted to see them. And you could drop in and they would look at how you're speaking and how you're articulating things and give you tips and advice. You would have dedicated training on these things. So that I didn't necessarily clock that it was useful at the time. But those sorts of skills have been things that I've then drawn on subsequently, much, much later in my career.
Yeah, definitely. And I'd imagine starting in a startup, a small startup, is probably quite useful for this kind of thing as well, because of the you're in everyone's pockets, and normally in that environment, you're a couple of desks away from C-suite. So I'd imagine that was fairly helpful as well.
Exactly right.
Um,
Yeah. You end
let,
up inevitably being close to the action one way or another. So you're using these skills for sure.
yeah, absolutely. As another thing, I mean, I'd maybe recommend just speaking on camera to people as well. Funnily enough, one of the things I found doing these sessions is I watch them back and I cringe at myself and the way I'm communicating and sometimes some of the buzzwords you're using. But as cringe as that is, it does improve you because you can see the way you're communicating in quite a sort of visceral way, I guess, and hopefully improve that. Well, let's get back to Robin. Let's get, I guess, onto the sort of the practical kind of things now. And we can start talking about, what is it that senior execs and C-suite really want to hear at interviews? So let me ask you that question. We'll start by, I'm going to ask you that as a sort of general question, and then what we'll do, we're going to move on to some examples, and you're going to give us a bad example of how you might communicate to a C-suite leader, and then a good example. So hopefully that'll be a really practical thing that people can see. But yeah, as a start, or as a general rule, what is it that, let's say, a CEO is looking for when they're interviewing a data and AI leader, do you think?
Yeah. So I'd probably start with what they're looking for and also what their expectation will be with you coming into the room, and think about almost the stereotype they'll hold of someone interviewing for a data leadership role. And we all have these assumptions that we make. I mean, in our technical teams, a business stakeholder is coming in to talk with the team, no doubt you'll hear them discussing how this person may not be technical. We'll need to adapt this thing. We can't mention that. We have these views that just come naturally. But the same is true the other way around. When you're the technical leader coming in and interviewing with a CEO or another C-level executive, and I think they're going to assume you're bright, you're technically qualified. What they'll be looking for that they think you may not have is whether you're commercial, you're thinking about business outcomes, whether you're delivery oriented, whether you can actually drive results. And I think also whether you have the leadership and influence skills to move things in a potentially complex environment. Again, depends a bit on the company you're in, but certainly if it's not a startup and it's more of a medium-sized, large organization, your role as a data leader has to be a disruptor in some way. You have to not only build great things within your lane, you need to be changing how the organization operates and constructively butting heads with others to make the organization different a couple of years out. That's what they'll be looking for as well, and what they might assume you may not have, just based on your background on the track that you've come in. So everyone knows those things, but I just stress the emphasis is probably stronger than we normally assume. And you'll want to be thinking about how you then cater for that when you're trying to convey your experience in these discussions as well.
Yeah. And in some ways, that's an encouraging thing, because I guess if those, well, it's an encouraging thing to think about to differentiate yourself. Because if those biases tend to be there, it should be viewed as a great opportunity, I think, to easily overcome those if you can get this style of communication right. So let's, as advertised, let's sort of, I guess we're kind of going to role play here and give a bad example of, let's say a C-suite is asking, I don't know, I'm asking you about, tell me about one of your recent projects, Rob, and how that impacted the business.
Sure. All right. And we'll start with maybe a bad example of how to do this then. All right. So let me give you one from Gousto, actually. So Gousto is the company I worked at before Global. And for those who don't know it, it's a recipe box business, very much like HelloFresh. You're presenting a range of recipes in an application. A user picks the ones they want. We ship the ingredients in precise proportions so that you can then cook them easily. It's all about making the cooking experience highly convenient for you. And what you see when you log in is that menu. That's all the recipes you could pick in a week. And one thing I did when I was there was build the data science product, but design those menus algorithmically. So maybe bad example of how to talk about this. So let's say we worked on an order menu optimization algorithm, which improved how we provision menus for our customers. For that, we used a genetic algorithm. So it created multiple different menu variants and then had a fitness function, which aimed to minimize SKU count and SKU unit costs and maximize variety. So it would then generate hundreds of potential menus, rank order them into a final list where we'd surface the top 10, and our menu planning teams would then review them. They'd add in any manual creation they want. They'd pick the best recipe for that week. And SKU count was important because you add more ingredients, so operational complexity increases. Each week you have more ingredients. Volumes for each will be on average lower. It's then harder to forecast. It's harder to design efficient pick faces and routing of your orders in your distribution centers. So by solving all of that, we ended up automating a huge amount of work and then supporting a business in scaling out the number of recipes we could offer. That's my bad example. How did I do?
If anyone listening wants to sort of comment on why they think that's a bad answer, do put it in the comments. So tell us, Rob, why is that a bad answer that necessarily won't land as effectively with a CEO or someone in the C-suite?
Yeah, so I think there's a few reasons. So it didn't have any kind of synthesis at the beginning that summarizes what I was talking about. Instead went straight into, we're working on menu optimization. And in reality, I may not get beyond that. Like, it may be that the exec jumps in immediately afterwards, asking questions and following up, and feels like they're losing hold of what I'm getting at. So that I think is one gap. I think there's also, if you notice, it was just quite descriptive. There's no hook that explains why it mattered. And I think that's useful to have early as well. Like, what is it that is the pressing challenge you're looking to solve? Why did the organization care? Why was it important? That wasn't there at all. It made it actually sound kind of humdrum, the way that I talked through it. And then I think there's a lot of information that's not going to be relevant to any non-technical executive. You could see there I'm talking about the top 10 highest performing recipes as a subset we'd pick, or points on SKU count and ingredient volumes in distribution centers, which I would be interested in. I'd be dropping those breadcrumbs for a more technical audience and looking to talk about them, but a more commercial exec just won't care. So I think that added just noise that detracts from what you're trying to demonstrate at that section in an interview. And then maybe lastly, just the impact was a bit weak. So I talk at the end about how this drives automation, scaling. It's very qualitative. It's unclear what that actually means. So you sort of walk away from that as an exec, not understanding whether it was actually important for the organization, not understanding if it drove commercial results, feeling like there's irrelevant detail that doesn't matter to you, and then that reflecting on you as a candidate as a result. So a number of things I could have done better.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's one of those things, you delivered it very confidently and articulated and in an articulate way, but at the same time, I think a lot of busy C-suite execs who just want to understand what the impact is would likely have kind of switched off pretty early with that. So give us the good example, Rob.
All right.
What's I'm sort of, hey Rob, tell us about a project at Gousto recently and how that impacted the business.
Let's try and do it a bit better. So let's talk about an example where we built an intelligent algorithm to automate creation of our weekly menu. And it gave us significant reductions in operating costs. It was really important in growing market share versus our competition. So with Gousto, our strategy was all about how we grew choice versus the competition. More recipes on our menu, more variations of those recipes. That's how we wanted to differentiate. And at the time, our main competitor offered 35 recipes, we offered 40. So we were barely ahead of the competition in differentiating where we wanted to. The problem was, the more recipes we added to our menu, the more complexity and cost we added to our operation. We had an internal team designing our menus every week by hand. That team had to keep growing, adding to headcount. And we had a supply chain that was becoming increasingly expensive. The more recipes we add, the more ingredient types we have to buy. As we do that, we lose economies of scale. We've got lower volumes of more varied ingredients than we had before. So each step forward was blocked. And the question was, can we actually differentiate on choice and do it at a competitive price point? Or do we need to make a trade-off and accept we become a more premium business with a higher price point, or just not compete on this dimension? And so we worked with our menu planning team to build an algorithm which solved for this. And it tried to automatically generate menus. On the one hand, creating menus at low cost with very few ingredients. On the other hand, maximizing the variety of the recipes you see. So it's like the most variety for the least ingredients. Common technique in restaurants as well, where you'll see the same ingredients reused between lunch, dinner, and so on, but still quite a varied menu that they try to deliver. We did that collaboratively. We worked with that menu planning team. They are still in the loop. They're adding their magic and their curation at the end. And that algorithm, once we released it, it helped us scale from 40 to 100 and beyond. The company's now at 200 plus recipes a week. And we reduced our unit cost. So on average, our unit cost per recipe went down 3 to 4%. And that was straight to the bottom line, even as the menu was scaling. So we managed to keep headcount static in that menu planning team, reduce unit cost, scale our recipes, grow quite a lot of market share as a result.
Yeah. There's a number of things I'm hearing there that are clearly going to stand out, I think, to a senior exec. But talk us through that. I guess unpack that a little, Rob. Why is that a good answer? What is it about that that's going to land better with a CEO or another C-suite exec?
Yeah, so probably still wasn't perfect, but had a few things that you wouldn't have seen in the previous example. You've got more of a headline at the top. So I tried to start with, just in a couple of sentences, what it was that we were doing, the context for that. And that's useful because it sets the scene, it anchors the rest of the conversation. But also, again, it may be the only thing you end up covering in reality. So at least you've got that snapshot in and they can probe where they want to probe. Had clearer benefit. It's not just about being quantitative. I think it's about talking in a language a commercial exec understands. So we're talking here about unit cost. We're talking here about margin. We're talking about headcount. They are things that they will care about. We're not talking about automation on its own or scaling on its own. So I think the language fits better with what someone wants to understand and shows that commerciality. And then it's just about like dropping some other breadcrumbs that might be relevant later on. So here I tried to make a bit of a point on the collaboration, which is something that if you mention it might get asked about. And that opens up an interesting question like, oh, how did you land this algorithm when you had a menu planning team that was trying to scale its headcount? And it gets you into more of a place where you can talk about the influence and your ability to land change in a business. So it has that as well. So it's a bit more commercial, that crisp synthesis at the top, and just trying to show some attributes that you want to show, not just the economics, but the leadership skills that you'll need in a role.
Yeah, 100%. And there are a few things there, but there's one thing in particular that stood out in the first line for me, which was, it allowed us to increase market share against our competitors. And we're going to kind of come on and talk about, which, by the way, is a line that a CEO is going to love and going to lean into straight away. So, and we're going to come on and talk about that a bit more now. So we're going to give everyone a sort of visual, which I'm going to add to the stage now, of not that one, this one. Here we go. A data storytelling framework visual, which if you play back Rob's answer there, you'll see that he kind of followed this framework. But also, what is probably the most crucial aspect, I think, in my opinion, of this is getting that headline right when you're telling these data stories, which Rob did really well there. And if you get that right, as we've said here, it's short, sharp, and impactful. And it often is only a 20, maybe 30-second piece of verbiage, if you like. But if you get it right and snappy and sharp and impactful, people will lean in. If you get that piece wrong, you're behind the 8 ball right from the get-go. It's very hard to drag it back from there often, because you've lost people. But do you want to talk us through this framework in a bit more detail, Rob? And actually, just before you do, anyone that's listening, watching, if you want this framework as a visual, please, happy to send it out to anyone. So please put in the comments, just write data storytelling framework, or send me the framework or whatever in the comments, and I'll make sure we get that out to you post this LinkedIn Live. But yeah, Rob, do you want to talk us through this as a concept?
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, with any job interview, you need to go with the flow, and it ends up being a conversation, but it's useful to have a framework in your back pocket for if you are talking through something you've done, knowing how you structure that. So here, that headline, I think, like you said, Jeremy, that is by far the most important part of this. And it's actually a similar approach to how newspaper articles used to be written. Like if you read a newspaper article, you'll traditionally have the first paragraph almost encapsulating the whole story. Why? Because readers sometimes wouldn't go further than that. They would just look at, quickly skim reading what happened and move on. So you almost want to be trying to describe the essence of what you've done in the example in a couple of paragraphs in 20, 30 seconds. You do that, it sets the scene. People know where you're going from there. They can jump in if they want to. That's really important. Not many people do that well. And it's quite an easy flip to your style that you can introduce. So you have that. And then there's a couple of bits you also want to be doing early on. So situation, setting the scene a bit, giving some context. So in my example, I was describing there how Gousto differentiated based on choice. We wanted to list more recipes. We were struggling to do that, etc. So I'm just kind of setting the scene behind the story that I'm going to then go into. Again, quite short. Then your complication. This is almost your hook. So to the point earlier on wanting to have something maybe more emotive, something that resonates more, here's where you try and get into the interviewer's head that this really mattered. Like you were hitting some big barriers, there were some big challenges, and they were important. So for me, that example before, I'm saying things like, we were struggling to land our strategy. Like we were trying to expand this, and our headcount was growing and our operational cost was increasing. That's a big problem. That's quite a fundamental problem for the organization. Contrast that with my first bad example. There's no real hook. It wasn't obvious why it mattered. This is where you land how it matters. And then your actions, what steps you did. Be selective here. You can't talk about everything, but you do want to speak to particular and important things that you did. And you probably want to think both about not just what was most important in the situation, but if there were 5 or 6 things you did, which will be the ones that are most relevant for the kind of things that the interviewer is looking to understand. So if you think they're looking to understand your ability to influence or your ability to communicate out, maybe it's worth emphasizing those points. And lastly, the results. So any value you've delivered, it could be qualitative, it could be quantitative, but you want it to be clear that this led to some tangible organizational commercial outcome if you can. So again, simple framework. Don't use it as a prescriptive solution step by step necessarily, but have it in your back pocket as a loose guide. And I think it can often help us in structuring answers that we want to prep for.
Yeah, I was about to ask you, funnily enough, so how fluid is this as a framework? And is there often an element that you have to read the room to who you're speaking to, in the sense that, hey, maybe if you feel someone is short of time or just wants to hear one thing, you might just want to go headline resolution. Are there instances where you might just want to do that? As I say, reading the room to some extent.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, and I think the more if you're more mid-level and you're interviewing for roles that are at that stage, you often will have interviewers who let you step through everything. When you're at the more senior levels and you're interviewing with very senior C-level execs or the level below, they're often going to have quite strong personalities. They're often going to be optimizing their time as effectively as possible. They will want to be driving things. So you have to just go with the flow a bit in practice. And I think you're absolutely right. Like, let's say you've been in an interview with a C-level exec. They're punchy, they're asking questions, they're driving the agenda. You're going to know pretty quickly you're not going to have 3 minutes to step through a whole story, or even 2 minutes, or even one. So you end up giving that headline, maybe giving a couple of points from your resolution, and then just let them jump in and ask things that they want to ask. And then you've just got to be thoughtful in, with those couple of paragraphs that you can use, how you're planting enough seeds for things that might be interesting for them to follow up on later. You won't be able to expand on them immediately, but there might be things they then pick up on and ask about, and then off you go. So yeah, you've got to read the room, got to adapt where you need to, and more often than not at senior levels, it's pretty fluid in practice.
Yeah, I think so. And going back to the headline, as an example that I can give of something recent that I worked on as to why that headline is so absolutely crucial, is I had a senior data science exec on a sort of final interview stage, I guess, with a pretty sizable business. And the final interview stage was meeting 3 C-suite execs back to back, and he was tasked with meeting them, getting to know them over a short period of time. I think it was sort of 20, half an hour each. And as part of that, he knew he was going to have to talk about a use case at a previous business. So I did some prep with this individual, and he talked me through the use case that he was going to talk about, and it was a brilliant one, because he developed an AI model that reconciled invoice payments with contracts, and this business was overspending on invoice payments by something around circa 20 million annually, and he'd created an AI model that kind of solved that overnight, saved them $20 million, and also I think it allowed them to sort of kick out a forensics unit of a Big Four that they were paying $1.5 million to do that previously. So it was a massive win. The issue was in his story, he started really by talking about number 3, complication and action. That's where he started, and he talked about that for about 5 minutes, to the point where, when I was listening, I really didn't understand what he was talking about, why it was important to the organization, or the impact it had. And it was probably only at the sort of 7-minute point that he mentioned, hey, we solved the $20 million overspend problem, and the CFO was, it was a huge weight off the CFO's mind. He was delighted. So he hadn't, the headline was that, and it took him 7 minutes to get to the headline. The point being, by which time he'd have lost C-suite. So we worked on, essentially, it was quite a quick fix. We worked on making sure that simple headline, developed an AI model that reconciled invoice payments with contracts and saved the business $20 million a year. That was the headline. It was slightly more than that, but that was the impactful headline. Luckily, interview went well. But I think it was a great example of how, or where, you can go wrong if you don't get that in up front. So finally, and by the way, everyone, we're kind of just past the half hour. We're overrunning as per usual. Me and Rob are going to speak for probably another 3 or 4 minutes now on some commercial mindset hacks, or hacks you can use to display commercial mindset in interviews. But if there's any questions or queries, please get them in the comments down below ASAP, because Rob and I are probably going to end in the next 5 minutes in terms of this part of the LinkedIn Live. Great, thanks Rob for that on data storytelling. Hugely impactful, I think. Let's talk about. Well, let me remove this data storytelling framework. And by the way, anyone, as I say, wants that framework, that visual please either message me directly or put a message in the comments, and I'll send it to you. Next thing we want to talk about, Rob, was and I know this, when you told me about this sounded so simple, but so impactful. Give us a tip on how data and AI leaders can demonstrate a commercial mindset to C-suite in interviews.
Yeah, so this is a really simple one, and it's from exactly the points I mentioned at the top. You're going to be wanting to demonstrate that you're commercial, you're thinking about business, that you are delivery oriented, that you're focused on being able to enact change in an organization, influence others. And you can demonstrate that in many ways, but a really simple thing you can do is just pitch the questions that you ask in such a way that you're demonstrating that interest as well. So that may be asking questions that focus on business strategy and commercial direction, growth opportunities for the business. If it's more about tech, maybe it's opportunities to consolidate, simplify, reduce costs in your architecture. But things that kind of show that commercial interest. And I think the more you can be specific, the better. So if it's an industry you know well, show that. So for me, if it's media, I'd be asking about customer mix. Are clients big companies or small or medium-sized businesses? If not the latter, then that's a growth opportunity. Or whether it's direct clients or agencies, and things that show you're kind of into the, not just technical detail, but business detail. And that can be a really useful thing to do. And it doesn't need to be all the questions you ask, but even just one that shows that with an exec who you know will have more of a commercial background. That can flip the perception at that last point of the interview, where it's almost the last thing they walk away with an impression of you of. So really easy thing to do, but can be quite impactful.
That's a great example in the media industry. Are there any other sort of typical examples, of different industries that you could use to get into that commercial conversation, do you think?
Yeah, so I think there are some quite general points you can pick on, which will be agnostic of industry. So if you're looking at the competitor landscape, how do you differentiate versus them? Like for this business, how is it that you're competing right now, and how do you want that to change? Like regardless of industry, that's going to be important. Whether questions about company strategy, like not just what are the strategic objectives, but what's the emphasis? Are we focusing over the next 2 years on cost out and optimization, or are we focusing more on investment that drives top line? Where often a strategy will emphasize more of one or the other, top line or bottom line, depending on where a company's at. Those are a couple of things you can ask that will be useful regardless of industry. But then if you are in one that you know well, you can be much more specific and targeted in what you want to go for.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rob. It sounds so simple, but it's amazing how few leaders would ask those kind of questions at interview. Something as simple as, what does the competitive landscape look like? Where do you sit within that? What's strategy moving forward? I think those things are absolutely crucial. So yeah, we probably haven't heralded that enough, but I think that's as important a point as any that we've spoken about today. So Rob, thank you very much for today. This has been hugely beneficial, I think, and informative. I guess one thing to finish is that, or one question for you to finish is that I think one of the things that's difficult for people is that it's very, very difficult to get true interview feedback. And I say that as a recruiter in this space, and having seen thousands of processes, I think it's very difficult for candidates to get true interview feedback. Are there anything that you'd recommend people can do that are interviewing or going for jobs to try and get some sort of a real assessment of how they've performed at interview?
Yeah, really good question. I don't know if I have a great answer, but I've got a couple of ideas. And it's been a few years since I've been doing this myself in the market, but I think one thing you can do that's quite easy is make sure you've built quite a good relationship with the recruiter you're working with, whether it's internal or external, and use that as a way to gather just more real feedback about what's happening, because there are only two reasons why you won't get real feedback. Either it's because the interviewers haven't shared it with the recruitment and talent team or the recruiter, or because the latter isn't sharing it with you and doesn't want to upset you or what have you. Build a good relationship with the latter, you're more likely to get just a real view on what you might be doing wrong, and they'll feel like they want to invest more in you. That's always useful. And then I think if you've got a good connection, it might be a recruiter you're working with as well, or it might be someone else in industry who's hiring for a lot of roles and has done a lot of these things. Do a bit of a practice with them. I really like the example you shared early on, where it felt like you doing that one practice session changed everything for the candidate. And yeah, that will change the feedback they'll get later on, but the kind of things that you spotted will be things that would have been spotted and called out, and may not have been relayed to them later on. So that's always a good one to do as well, to get you a view on where you can improve.
I think so. I think if you've got that relationship with the recruiter and you can do those sessions, they can be very valuable. You can actually spot things, even if the recruiter or whoever you're presenting to doesn't. You can actually, by doing it in that way, you can spot things yourself often in that format. So it's a really good thing to do. And yeah, I mean, to your point about kind of, if you have a good relationship, I think you're more likely to get real feedback. I think that's true. And I think it's difficult because I think when you're in these interview situations and going for a job, it's very easy to become a bit anxious and defensive. And I think it's in those scenarios that then people feel conscious that actually by giving you that real feedback, it might be upsetting. So I think the more individuals can kind of, and it's difficult, I appreciate, but show a sort of, I guess, an openness and a sort of willingness to hear feedback, the better. Although, as I say, I appreciate hearing sometimes things about yourself that you might not want to hear aren't nice, but it's having that mindset, I think. We've had a question come in from Steve Nevin. Rob, do you always try to link use cases or your illustrative examples in interview back to the organization business strategy?
Yeah, so I think it is context dependent. So I think you start with who's interviewing you. What is it that you think they'll want to know? And it's an interview with a technical leader, and where it's pretty clear they want to dig into your technical knowledge or your ability to manage technical teams, etc. But let's say it's the case where it's a commercial executive and you think they'll be interested in the impact you can make in an organization. I think if that's true, it's important to have examples that kind of show a commercial impact or an organizational benefit. Doesn't necessarily have to link to a business strategy. Nice if it can, but it might be you delivered an initiative, it drove cost out of part of the organization. It may be disconnected from the strategy, which may be about future growth and international expansion or whatever, but you might still have saved a couple $100 grand EBITDA, and that's great. That's the kind of thing they want to hear. So it doesn't have to link back to strategy. I definitely wouldn't force that. If you did work on something that really is at the core of the strategy, great. I think the bonus reason for that is with any data leader, the challenge is going to be, how do you position data in such a place that it can actually influence the organization's direction and strategy? And if you have previously solved problems that were at the heart of that, amazing, because that's quite hard to do. So it's good to do, but not essential.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I guess if it's tactical but hugely impactful,
yep,
it's
exactly
still valuable. Yeah. Okay. One question for me, Rob, which is let's say a leader's in a role that for whatever reason, there's been some failure, which, as we know, I think the stat flying around, 80% of data and AI projects fail. So this is something that, we should be used to. But then, therefore, it's very difficult to maybe talk about impact in a tangible way. I've got my ideas about this, but what would you think about how a data and AI leader in that situation could handle interview questions when they're perceived to have come from something that might not have worked or failed?
Yeah, great question. And I think one you've got to prep for, because you will get interviews who ask about that. Like, tell me when you worked on a project that failed, for example. I mean, from my standpoint, and I'm opinionated on this one, I think you don't want to gloss over what happened. You don't want to be pretending it was actually all good and we were fine. I think you want to have real examples where there's been a project that failed that you can talk to, if that is indeed something that happened. In the same way that if someone asks you about a weakness, you want to give a real weakness. Otherwise, it shows either a lack of self-awareness or a defensiveness. But you just want to be thoughtful about, with an example you pick, what it is that it shows about you versus the circumstances. We've all had projects that have failed. I think the things you can do that will demonstrate something positive will either be circumstance dependent, like maybe it failed in the end, but actually what you did to try and get it delivering, or what you did to try and influence others to get there is really positive despite the outcome. Or it might be you really did mess up earlier in your career, but you reflected and you learned, and it shows that self-awareness. So just think about the context of, with an example, what it is that it shows in that respect.
Yeah, no, great answer. Thanks for that. It's a question in my role I get all the time, I think, and people are anxious about, but it doesn't mean you can't give a very good interview answer, I think. Great.
Absolutely.
Well, we're out of time, Rob. So thanks once again for joining us. This has been hugely valuable. It'll be available on LinkedIn Live, I think, for the next few days. We'll put it out on our YouTube channel. Anyone watching after the event, still please put, if you want that data storytelling framework, put that in the comments, because we can get that to you. And we've just, so before we go, after the North Bear show, let's get this question because it's just come in. Swanand asked, fantastic session, thank you. On the flip side, how do you address the perception of lack of technical background for leadership roles? That's an interesting one. What are your thoughts?
Very interesting one. Well, I think this one is a bit more simple in practice, even if it's tricky in theory, because in my view, you don't want to be going into a leadership role that requires technical expertise at a certain level of depth where you don't have it, because then you will struggle and it won't be the right step for you. So if you're less technical, you want to be going into a role where you're supported by the technical colleagues. But if you go into one where you're not that yourself, it's not going to be great. And you should assume that the people assessing will be able to suss out your technical knowledge without storytelling is helpful, but they'll be more likely to ask about how would you whiteboard an architecture in this space, or if you were building a data model for X, how would you do it? And they will elicit the technical knowledge through that. So important to keep yourself fresh. If you're a little bit out of practice, you'll need to make sure that you're sort of swatting up on things that you knew a year or two ago, but also not one where I think you need to worry as much about being able to emphasize your real expertise. It's much more on the behavioral stuff, I think, where people maybe sometimes have the expertise, but they're not always able to put their best foot forward. So that's my take on that one.
Yeah, I've got an angle on this because we often get asked to or given mandates for roles where a client may be at the start not 100% sure how technical a leader they need or not, and as part of our role we sort of take them through that journey to help them come to that decision. So if you're in that scenario, my answer to this question would be is absolutely lean into what you're good at and be 100% upfront about, if there's technical skills you lack in certain areas, and give examples though of where you've led teams in the past as a sort of functional leader, built out technical teams underneath, the successes that led to, why that worked in that situation, because you'll find that a lot of businesses have those questions when they start interviewing, and actually if you can kind of hold their hand through that process, a lot of the time you end up becoming the sort of chosen candidate of choice. You may not, but then at least you've helped an organization and they're winning, and your reputation will likely enhance because of that.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, often they think they want someone who can design the architecture in detail, but actually if you've built a great team, you can support in the areas you're less strong at and demonstrate that. It can flip the perspective on what's needed.
Yeah, 100%. And even if actually through your sort of insights and help, they conclude that no, we do want someone who's more hands-on technical, they'll have a good view of you. And as I say, it's reputation matters. And it's amazing how often good people refer other good people. You might, well, we interviewed this guy last week, he was great, he wasn't quite right for us, and then you get that sort of reputational enhancement and referrals. So that would be my 2 pennies worth on this topic. Thank you, Swanand. Really good question. Right, we really are out of time now, Rob. So look, thanks everyone for tuning in. Hopefully this has been a really valuable session for you all. And Rob, once again, thanks for your time. Really appreciate it.
It's been fun. Thanks a lot.
All right, good afternoon.